right. We are in Luke 23 this morning. And I love that song that we do, Good, Good Father, for a Good, Good Friday. And the title of today's message is Fantastic, Fantastic Faith. I have a lisp. Good Friday is the Friday before Easter, on which the crucifixion of Jesus is commemorated in the Christian church. It's traditionally a day of fasting and penance, and in the past, it's been known as Holy Friday, Great Friday, Black Friday, which is almost funny, Great Friday, or Easter Friday. As early as the first century church, they used to partake of prayer and fasting, but about the 4th century is when they began recognizing it as Good Friday, the Friday of the crucifixion. And I want to open up with a little story because, this is going to be a heavy message. We're looking at some serious stuff, so we got to have fun at some point. I want to make a point that you and I love revenge. We do. To illustrate, there were 3 Hell's Angels, and they drove their hogs up to a restaurant, walked inside, pushed both doors open. Everybody knew they were there. They're in their leather and their chains and they're smoking, and pushed their way through the cafe. And they noticed a truck driver all by himself in the corner eating his breakfast. And they thought, hey, this will be fun. We're going to mess with this guy. So the first biker takes his orange juice and dumps it all over the table, spills onto the man's lap. And they're looking to pick a fight. And he was wise enough to realize that there's 3 of them, there's 1 of me. So he takes a deep breath, he ignores it, continues eating his breakfast. Biker number 2, seeing that the OJ didn't faze him, took the man's coffee. It has cream and sugar in it, dumps it on his head. It's hot, the guy reacted, I'm sure, but quickly picked up his napkin. He dabs to get away the moisture. Again, doesn't want to pick a fight with 3 bikers, knowing that would be futile. So the 3rd biker thinks, I don't know what it's going to take here, but what he did is he took the man's pancakes, bacon, and eggs that were soft eggs, smeared them all over the man's chest, and down his abdomen. And they're waiting for this guy to spring up at any time, but he wouldn't do it. Rather, he gets to his feet, he dusts himself off with what little dignity he has left. He goes and he pays his check to the cashier and he walks out. Of course, these 3 bikers are very disappointed. They didn't get their fight. The guy drives off in his truck, and one biker says to the rest of his friends, "But I can't believe that guy. He's not much of a man." The waitress peeks out the window and looks and says, "Well, he's not much of a truck driver either because he just ran over 3 motorcycles." And the reason that we can laugh at that is because there's something in our nature that likes revenge, and we want to see justice carried out, which leads us to the cross. And so for Jesus on the cross to say, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," should arrest our attention because it's contrary to what we feel and what we think, okay? And here in Luke 23, Jesus is on his way towards the cross, literally carrying the cross, traveling with the cross. When we pick up around verse 33, he is probably too weak to carry that horizontal beam was between 75 and 100 pounds. But we do read in verse 26 of chapter 23 of Luke, it says, "Now as they led him away, they laid hold of a certain man, Simon, a Cyrenian, who was coming from the country, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it after Jesus." We were talking with Gary and Pastor Pat here earlier before the service started, and we might say, for example, that during the 12 hours between 9 p.m. Thursday and 9 a.m. Friday, Jesus suffered many things, both physically and in the high-stress challenges that take a toll on him physically. So, he's always somebody that we can go to when we're having our stress, right? When we're feeling in this life, in this world, we're feeling like things are closing in on you. Or isn't it interesting how sometimes it seems like, I don't know if Groundhog Day is a good illustration with Bill Murray, but sometimes it just seems like everything happens at one time, Well, he's the one of all the people that have ever lived that says, I know stress. I know emotional pain. I know physical pain. I know the mental gymnastics. And so We can say Jesus suffered great emotional stress in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? He goes there and he prays, and he has his 3 closest disciples, kind of there off, and he goes in, and his prayer is, Father, if there's any other way, if you can let this cup pass from me, let that happen. Nevertheless, your will, not mine, be done. And it indicates that he sweat great drops of blood from Luke 22:44. It's a very rare phenomenon, but bloody sweat, hematidrosis or hemihidrosis, may occur in high emotional states or in persons with bleeding disorders. So Jesus is somebody that we can go to. Jesus is somebody when you feel betrayed. How about when you feel betrayed by other believers, or unbelievers, or a mix, whatever? Jesus knows. He's got your ear, and he understands, okay? As a result of hemorrhaging in the sweat glands, the skin becomes fragile and tender. So from there, okay, he's got the emotional stress of abandonment by his disciples. On earth, these are his closest friends. And sometimes I think God takes us through the valley. There are those trials in life where it seems like maybe even the closest people to you maybe aren't getting what you're going through. Jesus gets. Jesus understands. Jesus hears, and he can identify with that. And so he suffered a severe physical beating at the home of the high priest. He had a sleepless night. A lot of us can relate to that. He suffered being forced to walk more than 2.5 miles, and all these factors made him especially vulnerable to the effects of scourging. And we know at this time in history, according to Roman scourging, you could die from just the scourging alone. In fact, when Pilate says, "Behold the man," a lot of commentators believe that he's saying, what kind of a man is in this kind of physical shape? Because we know that the lashing was designed to make somebody confess, and that if you would confess your sins, your faults, your crimes, they would lessen the blows, right? If Jesus would have confessed any crimes, he would have said, Chuck, you're going to be angrier than you needed to be in 2016. Mark, you shouldn't have had road rage. Gary, I don't know, too much starch in your socks. I don't know, but whatever, he would, if he had anything to confess, he would have confessed our sins. But Isaiah says he was silent, like a lamb before, the shearers, the ones that are killing him. And so he's especially vulnerable to the effects of scourging. And a Roman centurion, knowing the crucifixion had to take place, compels a visitor from Rhein, and that's northern Africa, Libya, to carry the cross the rest of the way. Actually, in this procession, if you've got the movie going on in your mind, Jesus is actually not the only one carrying a cross in this procession. There were 2 others as well. But we read that Simon bears it after Jesus. So this can either mean that Jesus took the front and Simon carried the rear, the lighter side of the cross, or Jesus took it to the gate of the city, which he did. Then Simon carried it from the gate to Calvary. So let's pick up Luke 23, verse 33. And when they came to the place that is called the skull, or Calvary, might be your translation, which means cranium in the Greek, there they crucified him, and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. There was actually a specific place outside the walls of Jerusalem, not far from the walls of the gates, where people were crucified. And it happened at this very place called Calvary, the place of the skull. And it was an established place where criminals were crucified. And because Jesus was fully a man, I wonder if any of those thoughts ever went through his mind that, the only crime that he committed was just loving people. That was really the only thing that he was guilty of. Because as we were talking again before the service started, Jesus chose his cross. The other 2 men were guilty. Okay, they were thieves. The Greek indicates that they were convicted for similar crimes, okay? but Jesus was innocent. But nailed to a cross where criminals were crucified. Notice, and I don't know if you've thought about this, but neither here nor in any of the other Gospels is crucifixion described. They don't really go through the painful details other than the mention of nails, which would have went into the wrists, okay? So some people have suggested that as horrific as the physical sufferings were, his major suffering was spiritual. Because he who knew no sin became sin for us, and he took all that sin upon us, but he also had that separation from the Father. You know, again, in our lives, it's interesting, but the cross ends up being the solution for you and I when we get away from the Father. Because for you and I to take up our crosses today is the death to self. It's the death to Jacob, to Mark, to Marty, to Jill. Okay? That's what the cross is today. It's saying, you know what? I feel this way, or I'm struggling, or I have this going on, but you know what? I'm going to put others first. And that's what the cross really represents, putting other people ahead of yourself, like the I am second, if you've seen that on Facebook. Also in the days, for example, when the New Testament was written, you wouldn't have to explain crucifixion. Okay? Everybody knew what it was like, so that's another reason why we're not given graphic detail. We also understand crucifixion better because of an archaeological discovery in 1968. Bone fragments of a man who'd been crucified in the era of the first century were discovered. And they discovered that the posture of the man had his knees bent at an extreme angle, so the legs weren't hanging down straight, but they were bent at a very sharp angle. And it was just also discovered that a crucified man wasn't very far off the ground. So there is a possibility that you could have looked at Jesus eye to eye while he was on the cross. Now, one difficulty regarding that was Jesus' cross may have been higher than normal, because one of the Gospels, Matthew or Mark, indicates they took a sponge to him, they put it on a pole. They may have done that, however, because the cross back then was an extreme object of disgust. People were just, they found it just the worst of all offenses. It was the most offensive thing that could happen. So humiliating, a degrading experience for somebody to get crucified. It was so bad, crucifixion is actually where we get our word excruciating from. In Latin, excruciating means out of the cross, okay? So that's what he was willing to do for us. And it's interesting that, I don't know how your week has been because it's Friday, okay? But sometimes in the course of your week, you don't do so well. And I love the fact that we are able to share honestly. But it's funny how, as I looked at this study and realized that Jesus didn't take revenge, right? He didn't take it out on his enemies. In fact, what he did is he gave them an opportunity in his pain and in his suffering to love them even greater. And I found that so convicting that I'm like, you know what? My bad mood, goodbye, bye-bye, okay? I got nothing, okay? But this is an image that both believer, at least in this country, and unbelievers are familiar with. 3 people on the cross divide people into the camps of either being a rejecter or a receiver of Jesus Christ. Verse 34. This is profound. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And they cast lots to divide his garments. You guys remember how many sayings are on the cross? 7. 7 sayings on the cross, right? So here in Luke, we've got 3. The first, the second, and the 7th. The first and the last are prayers to the Father. I think that's significant. It begins with the Father. It begins with the Father's will, and it ends with the Father. It ends with the Father's will. That's a great perspective for you and I. Each day, Father, what is your will? At the end of the day, Father, thank you for your will. Okay? The word forgive is actually a contraction. It means forth give, or to give sin forth that it may go clean away. Now, I know that especially this Friday and this Sunday are very usual messages that we hear yearly in Christianity. And sometimes these can just kind of, yeah, I've heard that, and we can look at this in that kind of perspective. But maybe just this thought, especially, we're not quite at communion, but as we go to communion, do you ever really grasp the fact that your sin has gone clean away? It's gone clean away. In a sense, it means that when I bring it back, I'm bringing on defilement to what Jesus has done, right, on the cross. Now, we can understand that. How much healthier is it going to be to integrate that? Because when you're able to do that, you're not held down by that sin. Aren't you freed from that? When you realize that you have been cleansed and you do not have to rehearse and review and live in that sin because he has cleansed you and he lived the kind of perfect sinless life that he is the only one that can do that. And sometimes his words, when he says, Father, forgive them, Father, forgive Chuck, Father, forgive Pat, Father, forgive Heather, means more than any other word spoken. Amen? Okay, so forgive, that it may go clean away, out of sight, out of mind, kind of like the scapegoat in the Old Testament. He says they know not what they do. Do we ever? Do we ever realize what our sin does? It's always greater than it seems because we never know the extent of the loss involved. A great question here, though, was this prayer answered? Acts 2:23 gives us some insight. This Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hand of lawless men. And the emphasis is on you there in Acts. 3,000 people who were justly accused of Jesus' crucifixion became believers in him, that actually were involved in his crucifixion, came to Jesus Christ. What keeps you and I coming from Jesus, coming to him every day, okay? So I would say, yes, Jesus' prayer is answered. We're here, okay? So Jesus' plea was, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Our plea needs to be, Father, forgive me, for I know now what I've done. The love of Jesus never fails. On the cross, he prayed even for his executioners, asking God, the Father, not to hold this sin against them. He probably prayed in this manner for his enemies all through his ministry. This prayer was heard and noted because, remember, it said that he had no quiet place to pray, so he was praying out loud. In my family, we all talk in our sleep. So not everything that comes out of our mouths is a prayer. But here with Jesus, he fulfilled his own command in Matthew 5:44 to love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good for those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. Remember that Jesus said at one point, he said, for which of these things are you beating me? Why was he hanging there? Because he healed the sick? Because he raised the dead? Because he fed the multitudes? Because he prayed for the children? Because he blessed people? Because he preached the good news to them? No. They don't know what they do. They did not realize that they were both guilty and then fulfilling what God called men to do. And so in this, Jesus recognized the blindness of his enemies in his prayer, but he recognizes that in us today too. And you know, it's funny, when I too recognize the blindness in other people, it affects me. You know, at first, a lot of times when we're dealing with people and they're blind to maybe what they're doing, you get mad, or you think, why don't you get it, you know? But Jesus here in this extreme situation recognizes the blindness of his enemies in prayer. It didn't excuse their guilt, okay, those who put him on the cross, but he set his enemies in the best possible light in his prayer to the Father. We can imitate that. That's something I can walk out of these doors. I can take that home, whether it's traffic, work, whatever, okay? So to pray with the same heart after the same pattern. Verse 35. The people stood by watching, but the rulers scoffed at him, saying, he saved others. Let him save himself. If he is the Christ of God, his chosen one. And the soldiers also mocked him, coming up, offering him sour wine, and saying, if you're the king of the Jews, save yourself. And there was also an inscription over him, this is the king of the Jews. That written charge was normally something that a criminal would carry on a sign as they were headed towards crucifixion, towards execution. And then it would be affixed to the cross so everybody would know that particular crime for that person. One commentator said the title of Jesus on the cross was written in 3 languages, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, to show the Jewish people that Jesus is the king of religion, to show the Greek people that Jesus is the king of wisdom, and to show the Roman people that Jesus is the king of power. But I want to bring again maybe the title of this message, Fantastic Faith, verses 39 through 42. One of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us. But the other rebuked him, saying, do you not fear God, since you're under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. And he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And I also want to read verse 43. And he said to him, truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. So 2 criminals, and it kind of raises the question, why do some people believe and some people don't? Both seem to have been exposed to the same sights and sounds, yet one joins in the mockery of Jesus. Actually, they both do at some point, but then the other one stops and he believes. And let's be honest, do you think that Jesus looked like he was going to be able to save anybody? He's hanging on a cross. So what great faith did this thief show, which is probably the greatest story of faith in all of the ministry of Jesus? It's been said that there's one deathbed conversion in the Bible so that no one would despair, but also that there's only one in the Bible so that nobody will presume. Okay? So there, in this congregation, we've seen deathbed people have been converted on their deathbed. Okay? But we don't want to presume in that. You don't want to wait till then. You know, you want to take advantage of today while today is today. As we're heading towards communion, which is a fun thing to say, I have an illustration about faith. A thirsty man sees a water pump in the middle of the desert. His water bottles are empty, and he comes upon this pump. Tied to it is a handwritten note put there by somebody before him, and the note reads this: I have buried a bottle of water to prime the pump. Don't drink any of it. Pour in half of it to wet the leather. Wait, and then pour in the rest. Then pump. The well has never gone dry, but the pump must be primed to bring the water up. When you're through drawing water, refill the bottle and bury it in the sand for the next traveler. Warning: you're going to be tempted to not believe this note and to want to consume the bottle. If you do, you'll soon be thirsty again, and so will be everyone else that follows you. And that's the choice that everybody has in this room. We can empty it all on ourselves, but we're going to be empty again. Or we can empty it onto God's hands, and if we do so, he promises that he's going to give us living water, and it's going to become in us a fountain springing up into everlasting life. And that's what that thief did. And I don't know how much he had to go on. I don't know how much experience he had. I mean, more than likely he would have seen Jesus getting crucified, but he took a step of faith. And yeah, I'm going to read the last 2 verses and we're going to head to communion. But I wonder what kind of leap of faith everybody in this room has this morning or this afternoon that God is speaking to us about. What has God been tugging on our heart that says, look, I've got something for you to trust me in. but you need to step out in that faith. As we wrap it up, verses 44 and 45, it says, "It was now about the 6th hour, and there was darkness all over the whole land until the 9th hour, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two." There's an ancient Roman historian whose name was Phlegon, and he made mention of this, which is actually an extraordinary solar eclipse as well as an earthquake, which would have been right around the time of Jesus' crucifixion. On a natural scale, it was actually impossible for there to be a solar eclipse because Passover always happened during what kind of a moon? Full moon. And the people that know astronomical things tell us you can't have a solar eclipse during a full moon unless you're God. And then you can 365 days a week of the year. So there's something supernatural about this darkness. Here's the point, especially with the tearing of the veil. I'm going to ask Mark to come up as we get ready to prepare for communion. Because that veil was torn from top to bottom, now man has free access to the throne of grace by the cross. That curtain, that veil, was a picture of the separation between God and man. And it was the way to intimacy with God, and it had been fully open for all. A Talmudic tradition says the doors of the temple opened automatically during the crucifixion. And so as we go to prepare and have another worship song, I want to invite all of you guys to come up and go ahead by your own and grab a piece of the cracker and one of the cups of the grape juice so we can all partake together as a family. I can go first.